Folks in Dawson Hollow had a way of looking right through you. It was a town built on oil and silence, where a man was measured by the grit under his nails and the secrets he kept behind his teeth. Strangers were like bad weather, tolerated, but nobody prayed for them to stick around. And that late afternoon, as the sun bled all over the oil derricks, turning them into skeletal giants, a storm was brewing. Not in the sky, but right there on the crumbling stone steps of Weaver's General Store. Her name was Mara Calloway, and she sat there holding her boy, Finn, like she was the last tree standing after a forest fire. Her dress was a ghost of something fine, its hem chewed to threads by 1,000 miles of bad road. The boy, maybe 7 years old, slept in her lap, his small hand tangled in her hair, oblivious to the heat and the dust that tasted like forgotten dreams. She wasn't broken, not quite. Tired, yes. But her back was straight, her chin was up. She stared down the empty street with a look that dared the whole world to take one more thing from her. And that's when she caught the eye of the devil himself. Abraham Cutter stood across the street on the porch of the Marrowbone Hotel, a place he owned, just like he owned most everything else from here to the river. 70 years had whittled him down to bone and barbed wire. But his eyes were as sharp as the day he'd built an oil empire on pure, uncut spite. He wasn't a man who wasted a single breath or a single step. And when he stepped off that porch, the floorboards groaning under his boots, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Whispers followed him like flies. He didn't walk. He laid claim to the ground he crossed. He stopped a few feet from her. Mara didn't flinch. He liked that. "Name's Abraham Cutter," he said, his voice the sound of rocks grinding together. "I own this town, this land, and the black gold underneath it. I got a son who can't give me a grandson. And you," his gaze dropped to the sleeping boy, "you look like you're fresh out of miracles." Mira's eyes, guarded and gray as a storm cloud, finally met his. "And what's the price of your miracle, Mr. Cutter?" she asked, her voice steady. He didn't waste time on pretty words. "You'll marry my son." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A dry, humorless sound escaped her lips. "You want me to marry a man I've never laid eyes on, so you can have my boy to polish your legacy?" He nodded, his face carved from stone. "I want my name to outlive me, and I think you're tired of wondering where your boy's next meal is coming from." Her lips thinned. That was a direct hit, and they both knew it. "You think you're the first man to offer me a trade for my dignity?" Abraham almost smiled. "I'm not offering you a trade, Miss Calloway. I'm offering you a fortress, a roof that don't leak, land under your feet, and a name that will shelter that boy from a world that eats children like him for breakfast. My name." She shifted Finn in her arms, a lioness protecting her cub. "And in return, I become a broodmare for your broken son?" The words were sharp, meant to draw blood. But Abraham didn't even blink. He respected the fire in her. Most folks cowered. "My son Nate is a good man. But life took more from him than it should have. He doesn't believe in anything anymore. I need him to believe in something again, even if I have to buy it for him." Mira studied him, reading the fine print in his soul. "I'm not a cure, Mr. Cutter, and I'm not a pawn." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're sitting on that step like a woman holding a losing hand. I'm offering you a whole new deck. All you have to do is play the cards." She looked past him, at the black skeletons of the oil derricks clawing at the sky. For a heartbeat, she looked defeated. But then her gaze snapped back to his, and it wasn't submission he saw. It was a verdict. "I'm not a woman you buy, Mr. Cutter." He finally allowed a thin, cruel smile. "Good, because I'm not in the market for anything cheap." She stood up then, slow and deliberate, hoisting Finn into her arms without ever breaking eye contact. "I'll see this fortress of yours," she said, "but don't you dare expect me to be grateful." "Gratitude is a currency for the poor," Abraham Cutter said, turning toward his wagon. "And you, Miss Calloway, are about to be very, very rich." The Cutter Ranch wasn't a home. It was a kingdom carved out of a godforsaken patch of dirt. 5,000 acres of scrubland and secrets, all patrolled by the ceaseless, groaning prayer of the oil rigs. The house itself was a 2-story monster of stone and timber, looking down on the valley like a predator. As Abraham's wagon rumbled up the long dirt road, Mira saw it wasn't just a ranch, it was a fortress. Barbed wire, taller than a man, lined the entire property, and she saw men with rifles slung over their shoulders, watching from the ridges. What in God's name was Abraham Cutter so afraid of? At the top of the porch steps, a man stood in the shadows. He leaned against a post, arms crossed, a figure both solid and hollowed out. Nathaniel Nate Cutter. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, but his eyes were ancient. A heavy, cruel-looking brace was visible on his right leg, a permanent reminder of something that had tried to break him. He watched them approach with a stillness that was colder than indifference. It was armor. Abraham climbed down and gestured to Mara. "This is Mara Calloway, and the boy, Finn. They're staying." Nate's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered to Mara, then to Finn, and they stayed there. The boy, waking up, gave a small, sleepy wave. A muscle in Nate's cheek twitched. It could have been a smile. It could have been a snarl. Mara climbed down from the wagon, refusing any help. She stood tall, meeting Nate's stare head-on. She'd seen that look before. A man who'd been judged and found wanting, one too many times. "Wasn't aware we were running a charity now," Nate said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. "You're aware now," Abraham grunted. The tension was so thick, Mara felt like she was wading through mud. "I don't need charity," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Put me to work." Nate's eyes sharpened, a flicker of something, maybe respect, maybe curiosity, in their depths. Before he could speak, Abraham cut in. "You'll start in the kitchen. Then you'll clean this house from top to bottom. God knows it needs it." Mira nodded once, shifting Finn on her hip. "Where do we sleep?" Abraham pointed to a small, desolate bunkhouse set away from the main building. "There, until things are settled." It wasn't a welcome, but it was a roof. Mira walked past both men without another word, her head held high. As she passed Nate, he spoke again, his voice so low she almost missed it. "My father buys people. He breaks them, and he owns them. You'll be the last thing he ever buys." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The days that followed were a quiet war. Mira worked like a woman possessed, scrubbing away years of dust and neglect from the cold, grand house. The place wasn't just old. It was a tomb, filled with locked doors and silent, watchful staff who answered only to Abraham. Finn, however, was immune to the oppressive quiet. He explored the ranch with the fearless curiosity of a child. And it was on one of these expeditions that he found Nate. Nate lived in a world of his own making, a world of routine and solitude. But Finn didn't understand boundaries. He'd just appear, sitting quietly a few feet away while Nate worked, fixing a saddle or organizing tools in the barn. He never asked for much, just a nod or a quiet answer to a simple question. One afternoon, Mara saw them from a distance. Nate was showing Finn how to tie a knot, his large, calloused hands patiently guiding the boy's small fingers. He wasn't smiling, but the hard lines around his mouth had softened. It was a crack in the armor, and it gave Mira a sliver of hope she hadn't realized she was looking for. But Abraham wasn't a patient man. He saw the slow thaw and decided to set it on fire. He called them all to the main dining room one evening, a cavernous space they hadn't once used. The table was set with gleaming silver and crystal, a mockery of a family dinner. Abraham stood at the head of the table, a king in his castle. "I've wasted enough time," he announced. "This family needs an heir. The boy," he gestured to Finn, "can be a Cutter by name. All it takes is for the two of you to do the sensible thing and get married." Mira's fork clattered against her plate. Nate went rigid. "I ain't a whole man, Pa," Nate said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want a grandson to carry the Cutter name? You're not getting one from me." Abraham's face darkened. "You have hands. You have a brain. I don't have what you want." Nate's voice finally cracked, the sound of something shattering inside him. "I can't give you a legacy. It ended for me in that mine. This marriage is a lie, and parading it in front of the town won't change a damn thing." Mira had heard enough. She wasn't a prize to be won or a contract to be signed. She stood up, her eyes blazing. "Mr. Cutter, I didn't come here to be bartered over like cattle. If I marry your son, it will be because I'm marrying a man. not a family name. Abraham's control was slipping. A name is all that matters, he roared. Not to the dirt we all end up under, Mira shot back. Nate looked at her then, a flicker of raw gratitude in his eyes. He pushed his chair back, the sound screeching across the floor. I won't be anyone's pity project, he muttered and limped out of the room, leaving his father standing there, the master of a house that no longer obeyed him. The old man looked defeated, but then his eyes landed on Mara, and they were filled with a cold, calculating fury. He had lost this battle, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Abraham Cutter had not yet lost the war, and she was standing right in the middle of his battlefield. He pointed a trembling finger at her. You think you've won? You think you've gotten through to him? You've done nothing but complicate things. That boy of yours will never be a Cutter, not now. He stormed out, leaving Mara alone in the vast, empty room. But as she stood there, a cold dread washed over her. It wasn't just about a marriage anymore. Nate's words echoed in her mind. It ended for me in that mine. What had really happened down there? And why did Nate's warning on that first day suddenly feel less like a promise and more like a prophecy? She was in the fortress, but she was beginning to suspect the walls weren't built to keep strangers out. They were built to keep a terrible secret in. Life on the Cutter Ranch settled into a tense, unspoken truce. Abraham was a thundercloud on the horizon, always watching, his disapproval a physical presence. Nate remained a ghost in his own home, spending his days working the rigs alone, pushing his broken body to its limits as a form of penance. But the truce had a weak spot, and its name was Finn. The boy, with his complete lack of guile, continued his slow, steady siege on Nate's fortress of solitude. He'd bring Nate a cool cup of water, or a strangely shaped rock he'd found, or simply sit and watch him work in comfortable silence. Mira watched these small interactions like a hawk, seeing the subtle shifts. The way Nate's hands would still for a moment when Finn appeared. The way his shoulders would lose some of their rigid tension. These were not the actions of a man who felt nothing. They were the actions of a man terrified of feeling anything at all. To escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house, Mira started taking Finn into Dawson Hollow for supplies. It was on one of these trips that the mystery of the Cutters began to unravel. She was at Weaver's General Store, the very place she had met Abraham, when a man approached her. He was tall and weathered, with eyes that held the same hard bitterness as the land. You're the woman staying out at the Cutter place, he said. It wasn't a question. I am, Mira replied, pulling Finn a little closer. Then you're either a fool or you're in on it, the man sneered. My name is Jedediah Weaver. My family used to own half the land Cutter now calls his own. He didn't buy it. He bled it from us. Mira tried to walk away, but he stepped in her path. He's a snake, ma'am. A snake who poisons everything he touches. You ask his son. Ask Nate what really happened in that mine shaft 2 years ago. The one that crippled him and killed 2 good men. Weaver leaned closer, his voice dropping. One of those men. His name was Daniel Calloway, your husband. The world tilted on its axis. The floor seemed to drop out from under her feet. Daniel. The company had told her it was a tragic accident, a geological instability, a freak event. They had given her a paltry sum and sent her on her way. She had never once connected it to the oil baron, Abraham Cutter. It couldn't be a coincidence. Abraham hadn't found her by chance on those steps. He had sought her out. But why? Why bring the widow of a man who died on his land into his own home? What kind of twisted game was he playing? She stumbled out of the store, her mind reeling. The looks from the townspeople now made sense. The pity, the suspicion, they all knew. They all knew who she was, and they had been waiting to see what she would do. She drove back to the ranch in a daze, Jedediah Weaver's words echoing in her head. When she arrived, she didn't go to the kitchen or the bunkhouse. She marched straight to the main house and found Abraham on the porch, rocking in his chair as if he didn't have a care in the world. You knew, she said, her voice trembling with a rage she didn't know she possessed. You knew who I was the entire time. Abraham stopped rocking. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. I know many things, Miss Calloway. My husband died in your mine, she choked out. An accident, they told me. It was a tragedy, he said, his voice flat. Why bring me here? She screamed, the question tearing from her throat. Why me? Is this some kind of sick penance? Do you get to wipe the blood off your hands by playing savior to his wife and child? Abraham stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. His eyes were cold as chips of ice. You are asking questions that have answers better left buried. You have a roof over your head. Your boy is safe. That is more than your husband could give you. I suggest you remember that. He turned to go inside, but Mira grabbed his arm. What happened in that mine? He shook her off, his face contorted in a snarl. What happened is that my son is half the man he was, and your husband is dead. I am trying to build something from the ashes. Don't you dare try to stand in my way. He disappeared into the house, the slam of the heavy oak door sounding like a final judgment. Mara was left on the porch, shaking and cold, the terrible truth settling over her. She wasn't a guest here. She wasn't an employee. She was a prisoner, entangled in a dark history she was never meant to uncover. And Nate, the broken man she was supposed to marry, was standing right at the heart of it. He hadn't just been injured in that accident. He had been a witness. Or worse. Maybe, just maybe, he had been the cause. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She had to know the truth, and she had a horrifying feeling that the only way to get it was to get closer to the one person who terrified her most, her future husband. Mara was now a spy in her own life. Every chore was a reconnaissance mission. Every quiet moment was an opportunity for observation. She watched Nate searching for clues in his haunted eyes, in the way he flinched from loud noises. In the precise, almost obsessive way he maintained the ranch equipment, as if daring another piece of machinery to fail him. She had to get into his past, into the life he lived before the mine collapsed and took everything from him. The staff, loyal dogs to Abraham, watched her constantly, but she was smarter. She learned their routines, their blind spots. She discovered that one room in the sprawling house was always kept locked, Nate's old bedroom from before the accident. He now slept in a small, Spartan room downstairs, but his former life was sealed away upstairs like a pharaoh's tomb. Why? What was Abraham hiding in there? She had to get inside. It took her a week of careful observation to steal the master key from the housekeeper's ring for just 5 minutes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she slid the old brass key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, groaning click. The air inside the room was stale, thick with dust and disuse. It was the room of a young man with a future. Books on engineering and geology lined the shelves. Blueprints and survey maps were pinned to a corkboard. But it was the desk that drew her in. She rifled through the drawers, finding old ledgers, receipts, and letters. And then she found it, a leather-bound journal. Nate's journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The entries from the months before the collapse were filled with a growing sense of dread. October 12th. Father is pushing the crews too hard. He's cutting corners on safety supports to beat Weaver to the new vein. I've told him it's not stable. He won't listen. Says Weavers are trying to sabotage us. October 19th. Daniel Calloway and Old Man Weaver's boy, Thomas, are the only two on my crew I trust. They see it too. They know the west wall is unstable. We've been shoring it up ourselves after hours. Father would kill me if he knew. November 3rd. There was another tremor today. Minor, but the men are spooked. Father called me a coward. Said a cutter doesn't flinch from progress. He brought in a new foreman, a man I don't know. He watches me. He watches everything. The last entry was dated the morning of the collapse, November 5th. Daniel says he found something last night. Strange wiring near the west wall support beams. Doesn't look like any equipment we use. He thinks someone is trying to make the instability look like an accident. He's going to show me this morning. I have a bad feeling. A real bad feeling. Mira's blood ran cold. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple cave-in. It was a setup, sabotage. But by who? The Weavers, as Abraham claimed? Or was it something far more sinister? Tucked into the back of the journal was a folded yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter written in Nate's hand, addressed to her, to Mira Calloway, but it had never been sent. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. Mara, I don't know if this will ever reach you. By the time you read this, everyone will tell you what happened was my fault. They'll say I was negligent, that I pushed my men too hard, that I am to blame for your husband's death. And you should believe them. It was my crew, my responsibility. The guilt is something I will carry for the rest of my days. I am so sorry. I have failed you. I have failed him. Mira read it once, then twice. It didn't make sense. The journal was full of a man fighting for safety, a man who suspected foul play. The letter was a full-throated confession of guilt. It felt wrong, forced, like the words of a man who had been told what to write. Who would do that? Who would force their own son to take the blame for a murder? There was only one person with that kind of power, Abraham. He hadn't just covered up a murder. He had used it to break his own son, to chain him to the ranch with guilt and shame, turning him into the broken shell she saw today. Her quest for the truth had become something much more dangerous. She wasn't just fighting for her husband's memory anymore. She was fighting for Nate's soul. The knowledge burned in her gut. Abraham wasn't just a ruthless tycoon. He was a monster who had sacrificed his own son's spirit to protect his empire. And Nate wasn't a killer. He was a victim, trapped in the same gilded cage as she was. Her fear of him morphed into a fierce, protective pity. She had to get him to talk. She had to let him know that she knew he was innocent. But how? He was so walled off, so convinced of his own guilt. She started leaving the journal in places she knew he would find it. On the workbench, in the barn, on the seat of his truck, always open to a page detailing his worries before the collapse. She never said a word. She just left the truth lying in wait for him. At first he ignored it, but then she started noticing things. The journal would be moved, a page would be turned. He was reading it. He was remembering the man he used to be. The quiet war on the ranch escalated. Abraham could feel the shift in allegiance. He saw the way Mira looked at Nate now, not with suspicion, but with a deep, aching sadness. He saw the way Nate was slowly, hesitantly, starting to meet her gaze. The old man grew more volatile, his temper flaring at the smallest provocation. The fortress was turning on itself. Meanwhile, Jedediah Weaver was not a man to give up. He saw Mira's continued presence at the ranch not as a surrender, but as a betrayal. The whispers in town grew uglier. They said Mira had sold her husband's memory for a life of comfort, that she was no better than the Cutters. One sweltering afternoon, the conflict boiled over. Nate was in town, loading feed into his truck, with Finn helping by his side. Jedediah Weaver and two of his ranch hands cornered them. "Well, look what we have here," Weaver sneered, stepping in front of Nate. "The killer and his new family. You got some nerve showing your face in this town, Cutter." Nate ignored him, trying to guide Finn around the men. But Weaver wasn't having it. He shoved Nate hard. Nate stumbled, his bad leg giving way, and he went down on one knee. Finn cried out, rushing to his side. "You stay away from him!" the boy yelled, his small body trembling with a courage that stunned everyone. "You're just a bully," Weaver laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "This ain't your fight, kid. This is between men. Your pa there, he got my brother killed, and his father stole my inheritance." Before anyone could react, Nate was moving. He launched himself up from the ground, not with the grace of a healthy man, but with the raw fury of a cornered animal. He drove his shoulder into Weaver's chest, sending him staggering back. The two ranch hands moved in, but Nate was a whirlwind of desperation. He fought with a wild, untamed energy, a man with nothing left to lose. He took a punch to the jaw that snapped his head back, but he gave one back that sent one of the hands spitting blood. It was a brutal, ugly fight, but it wasn't a fight for dominance. It was a fight for a little boy who had called him Pa. Mara, who had just arrived in her own truck, saw the whole thing. She flew out of the vehicle, her heart in her throat. By the time she got there, the sheriff was breaking it up. Nate was bruised, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, but he was standing tall. He stood between Weaver and Finn, a human shield. The sheriff, a man firmly in Abraham Cutter's pocket, sent Weaver on his way with a warning. Mara rushed to Nate's side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her hands hovering over his bruised face. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with an emotion she'd never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't shame. It was life. For the first time, the ghost was gone. He called me Pa, Nate whispered, his voice hoarse. He looked down at Finn, who was clinging to his leg, and a dam broke inside him. 2 years of guilt and silence came pouring out. It wasn't my fault, Mara, he choked out, right there in the middle of the street. He made me say it was. He made me write that letter. It was sabotage, and he buried it. He buried the truth to protect the family name. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and undeniable. This was it, the truth she had been searching for. But hearing it from his lips, seeing the agony in his eyes was 100 times worse than reading it in a journal. Abraham hadn't just covered up a crime. He had stolen his son's voice, his honor, his very identity. They drove back to the ranch in a heavy silence. The fight had changed everything. Nate had not only defended Finn, he had defended his own innocence for the first time in 2 years. The war was no longer quiet. It was about to be declared. And as they pulled up the long drive to the house, they saw Abraham waiting on the porch, his face a mask of thunderous rage. The real storm was about to break. The confrontation on the porch was biblical. "You fool!" Abraham roared, his voice echoing across the yard. He wasn't looking at Nate's bruised face, but at the flicker of defiance in his eyes. "You let a two-bit land grabber like Weaver provoke you in public? You have any idea what you've done?" "I know what you've done," Nate shot back, his voice shaking but strong. He stepped in front of Mira and Finn, shielding them. "You let me take the blame for a murder you were too cowardly to solve. You buried 2 good men and what was left of your son under a mountain of lies, all to protect this empire of dirt." "I protected you," Abraham bellowed, taking a step forward. "The Weavers would have torn you apart. They would have seen you hang. I did what I had to do to keep you alive." "Alive?" Nate laughed, a broken, hollow sound. "You call this living? I've been a ghost in your house, haunted by men I didn't kill. You didn't save me, Father. You buried me." Mira stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the rage like a blade. "Your son isn't the only one you buried, Mr. Cutter. You buried my husband. You let me believe he died in an accident, and then you brought me into your home as some kind of project. A way to mend your broken son with a dead man's family? Did you think we wouldn't find out? Did you think the truth would stay buried forever?" For the first time since she'd met him, Abraham Cutter looked shaken. He looked from his son's accusing eyes to Mira's fiery gaze, and the foundation of his world began to crumble. He had controlled every aspect of this life, moved people like pawns on a chessboard, all to protect his legacy. Now his legacy was standing on his porch, hating him. The sky, as if on cue, began to darken. The wind picked up, howling through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain and ozone. A real storm was coming now, a physical manifestation of the tempest that had just broken over the Cutter family. "Get inside," Nate ordered, his focus shifting. "This is going to be a bad one." The storm hit with a fury that seemed personal. Rain came down in blinding sheets and the wind tore at the house like an angry god. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. They huddled in the main living room, the thunder rattling the windows in their frames. Finn, who should have been terrified, was surprisingly calm. He was pressed close to Nate's side, his small hand holding onto Nate's belt loop as if it were an anchor. In the midst of the chaos, something profound was happening. The walls between them, built of secrets and lies, were finally coming down. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, they were no longer a collection of broken individuals. They were a unit. Then a sound split the air, louder than any clap of thunder. A sickening crack, followed by a splintering groan, coming from the direction of the barn. "The horses!" Nate said, already moving toward the door. "No, Nate, it's too dangerous," Mira cried, grabbing his arm. "The roof could go at any second." "There's a filly in there that Finn loves," Nate said, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "I'm not letting anything else die on this ranch because I was too scared to act." He was gone before she could argue. Mira's heart seized with terror. She couldn't lose another man to a collapse, but she couldn't leave him to go alone. She turned to Abraham, who was standing by the fireplace, a statue of impotent rage. He needs help. The old man just stared at her, his face a grim mask. He made his choice. But Mara wasn't asking for his permission. She turned to run after Nate, but a small hand tugged on her dress. I'll go, Finn said, his voice small but determined. I know where she hides when she's scared. Before Mara could stop him, he slipped out the door and ran into the maelstrom, a tiny figure against the raging storm. Now, sheer animal panic took over. She ran out after him, screaming his name into the wind. The scene at the barn was a nightmare. A massive support beam had snapped, and half the roof had caved in. Nate was inside, trying to calm the panicked horses, his silhouette barely visible through the driving rain. Mara saw Finn slip under a broken fence rail and disappear into the darkness of the collapsing structure. Without a second thought, she followed him. Inside, it was chaos. Horses screamed and kicked, their eyes wild with terror. The wind howled through the gaping hole in the roof, and rain poured in. She found Finn huddled in a far stall, his arms wrapped around the neck of a trembling filly. She's scared, Ma, he yelled over the din. Just then, another deafening crack echoed above them. The main central beam, the one holding up what was left of the roof, began to splinter. Nate saw them. His face was a mask of pure horror. He lunged toward them, his bad leg dragging, screaming their names. Get out! Get out now! He shoved Finn toward Mara, just as the massive rafter came crashing down. Mara threw herself over her son, bracing for the impact, but it never came. She looked up. Nate was standing over them, his back to the falling beam. He had caught it. The full weight of the massive oak rafter was resting on his shoulders. His face was contorted in an agony that was beyond human, his muscles screaming, his bones groaning under the impossible load. But he held it. He held it long enough for her to scramble out from under with Finn. Run! He grunted, his voice a raw, guttural sound. Blood was trickling from his mouth. As she dragged Finn to safety, she looked back. Nate's legs buckled. The beam crashed down, burying him in a mountain of splintered wood and debris. Mara screamed, a sound of pure, primal loss that was swallowed by the storm. She thought he was gone. She thought she had lost him. But then a hand clawed its way out of the wreckage. Then another. Nate Cutter, battered, bleeding, and broken, began to pull himself from his own grave. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man who had stared death in the face twice and refused to blink. He dragged himself clear, his body a testament to unimaginable pain, and collapsed on the muddy ground. Mara ran to him, sobbing, cradling his head in her lap. He was alive. He was impossibly, miraculously alive. As they lay there in the mud and the rain, the storm began to subside, and through the clearing mist, they saw figures approaching. It was Jedediah Weaver and his men, their faces illuminated by lanterns. But they weren't looking at Nate or Mira. They were looking at the collapsed barn, and on Weaver's face was a look of pure, unadulterated shock and fury. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, one of his men muttered, loud enough for Mara to hear. The charge was only meant to drop the front beam, to block them in, not bring the whole roof down. The truth hit Mara with the force of a physical blow. The storm hadn't brought the barn down. The Weavers had. This wasn't an act of God. It was attempted murder. Jedediah Weaver saw the realization dawn on her face. His eyes went cold. He took a step toward them, his hand reaching for something at his belt. But a voice cut through the night, a voice that dripped with the authority of a king reclaiming his throne. Get away from my family. Abraham Cutter stood on the porch of the main house. And he wasn't alone. He was flanked by his armed ranch hands. And in his own hands he held a double-barreled shotgun aimed squarely at Jedediah Weaver's chest. The war for the Cutter legacy was over. The war for the Cutter family had just begun. The standoff at the ruined barn was a tableau of grudges old and new. Weaver, caught red-handed, his plan literally collapsed around him. Abraham the patriarch, finally choosing his son over his secrets. And in the middle, Nate and Mara, covered in mud and blood. The catalyst for it all. You tried to kill my son, Abraham said, his voice deadly calm. Weaver spat on the ground. He's not the only one who lost something in that mine, Cutter. You stole our land, you stole our future, and your negligence killed my brother. It wasn't negligence, Nate grunted from the ground, pushing himself up on one elbow. It was you, Weaver. The wiring Daniel found. It was yours. You set the blast to cripple our operation, but you made it too powerful. You killed your own brother along with Daniel. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. The look on Weaver's face was a confession. He had lived for 2 years blaming the Cutters for a death he himself had caused. The sheriff arrived, but this time he wasn't looking at Nate. He was looking at Weaver. Abraham had finally unleashed the truth, and the town's loyalty, bought and paid for over years, was holding firm. The Weavers were taken into custody, their reign of bitter vengeance over. Back in the house, the aftermath was quiet. Mira cleaned and bandaged Nate's wounds. He was a mosaic of bruises and cuts, and his back was a geography of new pain. But he was whole. Abraham watched them, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with physical injury. I was wrong, the old man said, the words sounding foreign and rusty on his tongue. I thought protecting the name, the land, was the only thing that mattered. I thought if I could just control everything, I could keep you safe. He looked at Nate. I saw how broken you were after the mine. I thought if I gave you the guilt, it would be a shield, something to keep you here, where I could watch you. I didn't realize I was building you a prison instead of a fortress. I'm sorry, son. The apology didn't fix 2 years of pain, but it was a start. It was the first stone laid in the foundation of something new. What happens now? Mara asked softly, looking between the two men. Nate reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. He then reached for Finn, who had been watching silently from the doorway, and pulled the boy into a gentle hug. Now, Nate said, looking at Mira, his eyes clear for the first time. Now, we build something that's ours. Not a legacy of oil and dirt, but a family. The town of Dawson Hollow eventually got the story straight, or as straight as these things ever get. They learned that the Cutter mine collapse wasn't an accident, but a crime perpetrated by the Weavers, a crime that had tragically backfired. The Cutter name, once associated with ruthless ambition, was now tinged with a strange kind of respect. They had weathered a storm no one had seen coming. On a clear autumn evening, months later, Nate, Mira, and Finn sat on the porch steps. The ranch was quieter now. Some of the rigs had been capped. The land was being allowed to breathe. Nate held out a small, worn wooden box to Mira. Inside, on a bed of velvet, was a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone. It wasn't flashy or expensive. It was simple. It was honest. I'm not going to ask you the way my father would have, Nate said, his voice low and steady. No contracts, no deals. I'm just asking. Mira Calloway, will you and Finn be my family? Mira didn't answer with words. She smiled, a real brilliant smile that reached her eyes. She took the ring from the box, and then she took Finn's hand and guided it, helping him slip the ring onto her finger. There was no preacher, no vows spoken into the wind. Just the three of them, under a vast and endless sky, choosing to be a family. On the balcony above, Abraham Cutter watched, not as a king surveying his empire, but as a father watching his son finally find his way home. He had spent his whole life fighting for a legacy, clawing his name into the land. But he saw now that a true legacy wasn't something you built with stone and steel. It was something you nurtured, something that grew in the quiet spaces between people who refused to let each other go. The Cutter Ranch had found its heir. It wasn't just a name, it was a promise. A promise that even the most broken things could be mended, and that the strongest families weren't born of blood, but forged in fire. If you enjoyed this story and believe that the deepest mysteries are the ones buried in the human heart, then you found your tribe. We tell stories about the dark places, the strange deals, and the shocking truths that lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the truth is always stranger than fiction, and we're just getting started.